We should certainly be doing a lot more, and we need to be doing a lot more very quickly if we don't want this to spread, and if we don't want to be enabling the spread of the virus in Iran and the deaths of many, many more people.
That's the voice of Ariane Tabatabai, adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia University. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. But first, here are your co-hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Thanks, Del. Good morning and welcome back to Press the Button. I'm Joe Cirincione.
And I'm Michelle. I am back and I am healthy. I'm so glad to be here.
And we're glad to have you, Michelle. It's wonderful to have you back.
And thank you so much to all of you who reached out to check on me. I really appreciate it in this moment of pandemic and crisis. On early warning this week, Joe and I will spend our 7 minutes discussing how the fallout from this virus will force us to redefine national security.
And in the interview, we speak with Ariane Tabatabai about the horrific toll the COVID-19 pandemic is taking in Iran and what the U.S. should do to help the Iranian people. Ariane is an adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia University and has joined us in the past for the early warning segment. In this interview, she also warns us that the pandemic will spread throughout the Middle East, making an unstable region even more chaotic. And in this, she echoes a joint statement that was released this week from 25 former world leaders, warning that Iranians are facing, quote, one of their country's darkest times in living memory, and, quote, reaching across borders to save lives is imperative for our own security and must override political differences among governments.
I highly recommend this interview. For me, it really pulled back the curtain on the reality and the gravity of the situation, taking me past, the headlines that we've been seeing in recent weeks. After Joe's conversation with her, we'll ask Joe a question on behalf of a listener in New Mexico. But we also have some special news to share with you.
That's right. This is our 52nd episode. So we've been doing this for a year, and next week, Press the Button will celebrate its podiversary. Happy birthday, Michelle.
Happy birthday, Joe. And I am so glad that in this time of deep depression, we are taking 2 weeks to celebrate. I think we should celebrate something.
And we're going to be celebrating this week by using social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, to highlight every one of those 52 episodes. So in case you missed some of the great guests we have, we'll give you at least a fleeting chance to catch up.
Give us a follow at Press It Button Pod as we look back on the year.
And as we celebrate, we're celebrating with you. We want to thank you, our listeners, for following us all year and for helping to spread the word and to bring this podcast, our favorite national security podcast, to your friends and your family. We're looking forward to celebrating over the next couple of weeks. And we want to do that with you, our listeners. We're very grateful that you've been following us and sharing the episodes with your friends and family. Thank you. Everything you do helps spread the word, helps grow our audience. But right now, we got a lot to discuss, and the clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dal. We're doing early warning a little differently today. My co-host, Joe, and I will spend 7 minutes talking about what the pandemic means for our understanding of national security. Joe, thank you so much for joining.
It's my pleasure, Michelle.
And our time starts now. You and Bill Hartung have an article in the National Interest about redefining national security, where you say that now is the time to correct our long-term national priorities to address the real threats to our security. What does that correction look like?
Well, I'm very grateful that the National Interest published this article. You can find it at nationalinterest.org. And I did it with Bill Hartung, one of the country's leading Pentagon analysts. And it argues that we have to redefine national security. In fact, that it's inconceivable that we're going to come out of this pandemic with the same definition of national security as we had going into it. Last week, the death toll from this virus passed 3,000. That was on Monday. Within hours, it soared past it. At the time we're recording this, we're at 11,000 dead, and it's going to go up. It's going to be 10 times that number, 20, 30 times that number. We don't know how many deaths the virus and the Trump administration's bumbling of its response to this crisis are going to cause us. But if that 9/11 terrorist attack were a handful of terrorists spent $1 million and attacked us and fundamentally changed U.S. national security strategy for the last 20 years, where it launched us on wars that have now consumed $11 trillion with almost nothing to show for it, for these endless foreign wars. If that event could change national security, so will this pandemic. And we argue that is a good thing, that it's time to close this period where the defense budget has been seen as sacrosanct, where for the last 20 years, it's been going relentlessly upward, where we're spending more now on national security, on the Pentagon, than we spent during the Korean War, during the Vietnam War, or during the Reagan buildup of the 1980s. And these massive expenditures are always considered vital. We have to do this. Oh, really? Are they really that vital? Do we really need this amount of spending when we're faced with pandemics and climate change and the threat of an accidental or unintentional nuclear war? Those are the real threats the country faces, and we have to start reconfiguring our budgetary priorities and our strategic thinking. Michelle, I hope this conversation that we're having right now can be part of that effort to get us to now rethink national security.
You had a great line in the piece that you quoted Jessica Matthews in a recent piece she wrote for the New York Review of Books, in which she said, defense spending crowds out funds for everything else a prosperous economy and healthy society needs. And when I read that, the thing that struck me is we're talking about two different things right now. We're talking about our understanding of national security, and we're talking about defense spending. And in our vernacular, I think experts will use those two terms interchangeably, and they're not. And that has led us to the point at where we're at today. And so I think as we rethink, obviously guns are not going to help us against a virus, but we also have to be careful in whether or not when we say, well, we're expanding this definition of national security, are we just securitizing everything? Are we asking the Defense Department to solve our pandemic problem? Which I don't think we are. We just had the recent episode on feminist foreign policy. What does it mean to put climate change, to put pandemics, to put, human health and safety and prosperity first, and not just say defense spending is number one?
Exactly. And thank you for giving me credit for Jessica Matthews' quote. If people haven't read her New York Review of Book article on this from last July, where she's making the same call, time to close this period, this 20 years of excessive military spending, you should, or listen to her podcast from a few weeks ago. The House Armed Services Committee just announced it was postponing until a later time their markup of the National Defense Authorization Act. That's good, because now it gives us time to reconsider this. And I think the House leadership has to take a real hard look at this, and I hope they will, and break the deal that they made last year where the Congress agreed to spend $750 billion for the upcoming fiscal year on the Pentagon. Why? Why would you do that? There are so many ways you can cut the budget now. I'm not asking you to cut it in half, but you could delay, for example, some of the nuclear modernization programs that we're going to spend $2 trillion on under current plans. Stop. Let's rethink that. You could cut the buys for the F-35, one of the most useless, overpriced tactical planes we've ever had, for example. One F-35, just one, could buy 2,200 ventilators. Which do you think we need more now? So I'm not calling for rethinking later. I'm saying rethink now. Now's the time to act. We're going to have to recover from a deep recession, maybe a depression. We're going to have trillions of dollars in cost for health care, just to take care of the people who are getting sick. And this pandemic has exposed the failures of our healthcare system. That's where we need the money, not in guns, planes, and tanks.
I also think there's a lesson to be learned from how our definitions of national security and defense spending changed after 9/11. where the way it was shaped and the areas that we invested in reflected agendas that were held before the actual attacks. So I completely agree that right now, while everyone is rethinking what the world looks like and how we live our lives, we should not be waiting to have these conversations and to make these changes.
The virus has in some ways done us a favor. It's helped reveal the world as it really is, not how this army of defense lobbyists wants us to conceive the world. Now's the time to be rethinking it, that we have to be part of that change. We in the outside government world, we in the mass movements have to be demanding that we put the money where the threats are, not where the lobbyists want it to go.
And with that, our time is up. Thank you, Joe, for joining.
Thank you, Michelle. Today, we are joined by Ariane Tabatabai, an adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia University. Thank you for speaking with us, Ariane. And can you please give us the big picture? How bad is the coronavirus pandemic in Iran?
Joe, thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on the show. Well, the coronavirus is quite bad in Iran. Iran is one of the epicenters for the disease. It is the epicenter in the region currently. And, for weeks and weeks, the Iranian government has been kind of dragging its feet, not giving us all the information, and at times kind of giving us half of the information, if not less, of the information that is available to them in terms of what's happening on the ground. But certainly as we speak now, Iran has surpassed the 3,000 official deaths due to the disease mark. And there are growing reports of more and more positive cases throughout the country. I should also add for listeners who may not be aware of this kind of cultural context here that the coronavirus peak in Iran was taking place around the time of the Persian New Year. So the Persian New Year is typically the 20th or 21st of March. And it is a time of celebration for Iranians. It's typically a time when people travel. They have a couple of weeks off, so they may be traveling. People go visit their families. One of the traditions is that you go and visit your relatives. You get presents. You eat together. So it's festive. It's sort of what we do around the Christmas and New Year time as well. And so what that means is that a lot of people were traveling between key cities and seeing a lot of people. And so there was this moment that was sort of helping the disease spread more. And at the same time, it's this moment where a lot of Iranians are starting to grapple with this pandemic. And there was more information that was sort of being reported. And so they were becoming aware of the pandemic around that time as well. At that time, so when the celebrations around Persian New Year started, the government didn't act fast enough to make people stop from traveling, for example. And that was very much criticized by public health officials and experts, saying that, people from Tehran were going up to the Caspian Sea, which is where they go because, it's pleasant, right? There is a sea. You kind of go and hang out there for a few days as you take a break from the city. But they were also bringing there were positive cases, perhaps, that were going there, people who were not showing symptoms who were traveling. And so there was this sort of impression that, the government could have done a lot more, and it was not really doing that.
And U.S. sanctions are making this worse. The sweeping U.S. sanctions that the Trump administration has imposed on Iran after the U.S. pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal are reportedly hampering Iranian efforts to import medicine, other medical supplies. This has prompted a nearly global plea to the United States from our allies, for example, our European allies, from the United Nations, for example, and dozens of U.S. legislators to lift the sanctions, to pull back the sanctions to allow Iran to get these supplies. Can you explain what the problem is and, if you can, what the solution is?
Yeah, so there's a few things to unpack here. The first thing is that, as I started to mention, the Iranian government's response to the spread of COVID-19 has been really quite terrible. And, the blame is squarely on them on this one. They have been covering up information. They have been very much one of the governments, along with the Chinese, for example, that's been responsible for propagating disinformation and, blaming, for example, the United States for waging biowarfare against Iran and other countries. Then there is the addition of the problem of sanctions, which is something that is not actually new, right? Already prior to COVID-19, there were a number of reports about the crisis that the Iranian healthcare system was experiencing due to U.S. sanctions. Now, it is also important to note that humanitarian trade with Iran is permitted under U.S. sanctions, right? We are not sanctioning medicine, medical devices, and food, for example. But the challenge, of course, is that that is not always easy to implement in practice. Companies and banks don't want to work with Iran, regardless of what the nature of that cooperation may be. And they're concerned about ending up on the U.S.'s blacklist, essentially. And of course, Iran is cut off from their national financial system. So there are a number of challenges that make it a lot more difficult for the Iranian government to get access to humanitarian items, so food, and in this particular case, medicine and medical devices and medical equipment. And this is something that activists, that rights groups had been noting for months prior to the outbreak of COVID-19. So in 2019, for example, Human Rights Watch had a report and a few other pieces of reporting where it laid out these challenges very clearly. The administration has been reluctant to do much about this, and that is very much a problem and has in fact led to what you were describing earlier on, which is that you've now had and again, this is even prior to COVID-19, our European allies, the French, the Germans, the British, and also the Swiss, were trying to get the United States to be more proactive, to help them facilitate humanitarian trade with Iran. And finally, there was the Swiss channel that was established just a few weeks ago. And this joint venture by the Germans, the French, and the British called Instex, which is again supposed to facilitate humanitarian trade with Iran, also completed its first transaction just a few days ago. So, there's been efforts from the Europeans' perspective, though the administration has been dragging its feet. And now we are at a point where all of these challenges that had been unfolding are coming to a head, because it's now taking place against the backdrop of this global pandemic that is, of course, having devastating impact on Iran, but that also has a regional and international dimension. Given that Iran, of course, is connected to other countries in the region, you have fragile governments throughout the region, a lot of conflict areas. You have camps that are housing refugees and displaced people, and so all of these are vulnerable populations, right? So we have to also take that into account. And so now you have a situation in which, aware of these challenges, our European allies, but also I think a growing number of Americans, people here at home, are advocating for at least loosening the sanctions a little bit. And there are nuances. There are people who are saying we should just kind of stop the sanctions altogether, end the maximum pressure campaign. And then you have people who are saying, well, let's not go quite that far. Let's not stop sanctioning Iran altogether. those sanctions are imposed for other reasons. But let's at least make sure that they do get access to the medical the medical equipment and medicine that they do need.
Right. So we had a letter in recent days from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and a few dozen others asking for the complete lifting of sanctions. And you've had editorials in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and others calling for that. But some, like Vice President Joe Biden, have argued for a middle path, which is not actually lifting the sanctions, but clarifying that this humanitarian aid is okay, that the U.S. will not sanction banks or companies that engage in that. Is that what you're talking about? This slight difference in the approach, and do you favor one or the other?
Yeah, that's right. There is a range of, I guess, opinions here. A third one to add is the one that was sort of championed by the Wall Street Journal's editorial, which is saying, look, now's not the time to sort of, loosen sanctions because, and I think this is something that actually has a lot of traction within parts of the administration. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a second. But there are folks who view the Iranian government, the regime, as being on its last leg. And if we push a bit more, it'll collapse internally, and then we don't have to worry about all the issues that we have with them, right? So there are these different sort of views on this. From my perspective, it's not realistic to call for the end of the maximum pressure campaign altogether. It's not realistic in the current environment to ask for the end of all sanctions. And in fact, I don't think it's necessarily desirable to do that. So I think I land more in the camp of the sort of in-between, right? Where I think that, yes, we should certainly be doing a lot more, and we need to be doing a lot more very quickly if we don't want this to spread throughout the region. And if we don't want to be in some ways, I don't want to say complicit, but at least sort of enabling the spread of the virus in Iran and the deaths of many, many more people. And I think that it is actually realistic to ask for the administration to ask for some concessions here rather than kind of lifting all sanctions immediately.
There is a very strong political debate in this country now about whether we should lift some sanctions or clarify or help Iran in any way. In recent weeks, I've seen a coordinated barrage of articles and social media posts from Iran hawks, the right-wing politicians, and some of their well-funded NGOs arguing that this pandemic could help bring down the regime. They are, in fact, weaponizing the coronavirus. They want to use it to topple the government. Is that how you see it?
So, yeah, I think there is certainly a school of thought in, I would say, outside of government, in the Beltway, and it seems to also be a school of thought within the administration itself. That views the regime on its last leg, that believes that the regime is so weak currently, as demonstrated by the protests of the past, at least of November, but also 2017, 2018, and that if we just give it a push, meaning that if we just let the coronavirus play out and take care of itself, that it will lead the regime to collapse fundamentally. I think that's actually misreading what's happening in Iran. I think that, yes, there is a lot of discontent within the country, and rightly so, right? Again, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of incompetence, corruption, mismanagement of the COVID-19 issue. And before that, the corruption and mismanagement existed in a number of other areas, including, you'll recall, it seems like many, many years ago, but it was just a couple of months ago, of the downing of the airliner when Iran was trying to retaliate for the killing of General Qasem Soleimani. So, yes, this corruption is there, this mismanagement is there, and Iranians, by and large, are frustrated with their regime. But to then draw the conclusion that the regime is about to lose control and it will collapse, I think, is taking it a step too far. The regime has also demonstrated a willingness to stay and keep control of the situation, regardless of the price of it, right? You'll recall in November, you had these protests where the regime, within just 78 hours or so, completely cracked down, killed hundreds of people, and shut down the internet to do that. So, this is not a government that is going to back down and that is going to lose control. And so I think that sort of, assuming that if we just let it play out, I mean, there's the fundamental ethical and humanitarian question, right? Are we willing to sort of sacrifice hundreds, thousands perhaps of lives of ordinary Iranians to get to that objective? There's also the practical question of, I think there's a bit of a misreading happening here.
Former Vice President Joe Biden said last week that, quote, "It is bad enough that the Trump administration abandoned the Iran nuclear deal in favor of a maximum pressure strategy that has badly backfired, encouraging Iran to become even more aggressive and restart its nuclear program. It makes no sense," the vice president said, "in a global health crisis to compound that failure with cruelty by inhibiting access to needed humanitarian assistance. Whatever our profound differences with the Iranian government, we should support the Iranian people." Now, in addition to the humanitarian aspect of that, as you've said it, I mean, it seems to me that there's a realpolitik opportunity here, that the United States wants to be seen by the Iranian people as helping them, not punishing them. And as you point out, that we want to help Iran contain this virus because the virus knows no borders. This could spread throughout the Middle East. Is that the way you see it?
I think that's exactly right. In fact, if you look at the region itself, there have been growing calls to get the United States to pause or ease sanctions currently to allow Iran to deal with this pandemic. And the reason for it is not that these regional states have all of a sudden found a love lost for Iran. It's because they see their own public health as threatened by the pandemic. So Pakistan, for example, had a statement asking for the easing of sanctions. The Emiratis, who have at various points over the past few years had a lot of their own tensions with Iran. In fact, just a few months ago, their own tankers were targeted by Iran in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. The Emiratis were one of the first to step in and say, "We will help you, Iran," and provided aid to deal with the pandemic. Again, it's not because they have all of a sudden decided that they don't have any challenges or distrust. It's because they understand that this is not going to be contained by borders. So there is that dimension to look at. I think the second thing, and Joe, I think you're exactly right to point this out, is that, there is a bit of a battle of narratives going on currently when it comes to COVID-19. You have the sort of Chinese and Iranian line that, the U.S. is responsible for COVID-19, which is, of course, completely false. And this is not, the U.S. Army did not create this pandemic. I don't know who needs to hear this, but that's just not how it happens. But there is a battle of narratives going on here. And in my view, giving Iran the upper hand by allowing them to actually claim that the United States is blocking humanitarian aid to Iran is not helpful either. So there is definitely the sort of practical and pragmatic way of looking at it, in which case I think we should really be providing some humanitarian aid. And there is also the very kind of the ethical and human dimension of this.
I am increasingly worried about how this pandemic is going to make every single situation we face in the world worse, how it's going to destabilize already destabilized regions. And at the top of my list is the Middle East. We have not yet seen this pandemic rip through, for example, the refugee camps that have over 1 million Syrians. We haven't really seen it hit the confined spaces of Gaza and the West Bank. I am deeply worried that in the months ahead, this pandemic could destabilize existing governments in the Middle East, could provoke migration that will make what we've seen in the past look like a warm-up act. But am I too worried about this? You're a Middle East expert. You are close to this region, Ariane. How do you see the next couple of months? What do you hope for, and what do you worry about?
Yeah, I'm also very concerned about, obviously, the pandemic in the region. I do think that the issue of refugee camps is one that is not getting enough attention. I mean, these refugee camps have been challenging from a humanitarian and security perspective for a while now. But the pandemic is just making everything worse. And should it start to spread in those places, we are going to be facing, again, not just a humanitarian challenge, but also Europe is going to be facing an even greater crisis than it has been in the past. So that is something to keep in mind. In my view, there is also this other dimension of it that is really just slipping under the radar. Over the past few weeks, there have been continued tensions between the United States and Iran in Iraq. And as I think many of us had predicted and warned against when this whole episode started in 2019, these tensions are largely playing out not in the United States, not in Iran, but in the broader region. And again, that is problematic because you already have countries that have been through a lot, right? Through conflicts, many of which were, of course, exacerbated by Iran. So there is that. But they've been through a lot, and now these tensions are playing out in their backyards. And so, just over the past month, 2 Americans have been killed in Iraq with. And rocket attacks that had been perpetrated by militias there. And Iran and its proxies, of course, have an incentive to continue to push because they want the United States out of Iraq. They also want to make sure that they do retaliate for the killing of Soleimani. And so they don't have an incentive to dial down the pressure. Here in Washington, you also have a camp within the administration led by Secretary Pompeo and also National Security Advisor O'Brien, who wants to dial up the pressure on Iran. And what that means is that you have this continued tension that is brewing at a time when we should, all of us, as a species, essentially, should be focused on this pandemic, and where many governments, including our own, are really struggling to respond to it. And so, my concern is that most Americans are probably not aware that there have been growing tensions between the U.S. and Iran and Iraq, rightly so, because they're concerned about their families and their jobs and the welfare of their community. So they're not going to be paying attention to what's going on, not in the near abroad, but in the Middle East, right? And this means that at a time when we should be focusing on the pandemic, we also have to be paying attention to this, and that you have these tensions that are happening at a time when the us as the people doesn't have the bandwidth to sort of provide a check on what's going on in foreign policy.
Yes. And one of the checks that been on Trump has been the analysis favored by Tucker Carlson, among others, that if Trump started a war in the Middle East, if he initiated attack against Iran, which, remember, he almost did twice in the past year, then that would lead to a global recession and would tank the U.S. economy, and Trump would lose the election. Well, guess what? We already have a global recession looming, perhaps even a depression. And that might remove one of the disincentives for the attack. And as this pandemic gets worse, as it becomes clearer and clearer that our administration has botched the response, as tensions rise in the United States, as we get closer to November, do you worry that Trump might be tempted to wag the dog, to do something that before the pandemic, I think many of us had ruled out as a low probability, that intentionally or by simply stumbling into it, there could be a U.S.-Iran war?
So, by all accounts, the president himself doesn't seem inclined to go to war with Iran.
Right.
I can't say the same thing of some of his close advisors. And, again, we've seen in reporting from the Times and the Post over the past few days, couple of weeks, that there is this kind of school of thought within the administration that is saying, look, now's the time to kind of finish off the regime, right? And again, luckily, so far at least, it doesn't seem like the president is biting, but that may not always be the case. But to me, that's not that's part of the story, but that's not the full story. Again, as all of the tensions and the escalation of the 2019, early 2020 show, once you start escalation, it's really, really hard to control. And so the bigger concern for me is actually stumbling into a conflict that nobody really wants. And I also think that the Iranians don't want an actual conflict, right? That they want to keep poking the U.S. in the eye and the region. They want to push the United States out of Iraq. All of that is true. But they also don't want an open direct conflict with the world's largest military power and a nuclear power at that. But again, that is not something that they can fully control. And that is the thing that is very concerning because, and this is something that, again, many of us had expressed concerns about, had warned against. When you start a crisis at a time when other things are seemingly going well, you can never guarantee that that crisis would have been solved by the time another crisis emerges. And this is exactly what we're seeing now today. The administration decided to walk out of the JCPOA. It decided to undertake this maximum pressure campaign. And for a while, it seemed like things were going on its terms because there wasn't a complicating factor. And then, of course, Iran got a vote and Iran started to react. And now it is still reacting as we have to focus on this global pandemic. And so you now have these two crises that are unfolding at the same time, with, of course, the administration having to put most of its attention and bandwidth into the pandemic, because that's what the most immediate threat is to Americans. So my concerns are more stumbling into something because you just have these crises that are laying over on one another and just kind of miscalculating, misjudging, and fundamentally just getting this escalation cycle completely get out of of the administration's hand as it's starting to do already, and land us in a place that nobody really wanted to end up in.
Yeah. Right. So we have these multiple crises, and we have what is perhaps the most inept government in U.S. history. We certainly are not reacting, as you say, as a species to the threat that is now facing us. Ariane Tabatabai, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to give us what is to me, just a brilliant, comprehensive view of the multiple crises we're facing with Iran and with the Middle East. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Letters, we get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now, the segment where I ask Joe a question he hasn't seen before. Joe, are you ready for this?
I love this segment. Thanks. Anytime, Michelle.
So Josh from New Mexico asked us, since we are all sheltering in place for the foreseeable future, what are your top 3 nuclear-related movies? How accurate are they?
Oh, wow. Good question. Okay, well, just last week, the AFI Film Club, this is the American Film Institute Film Club, had Robert De Niro, one of my favorite actors, who we tried to emulate in my life. You looking at me? Him, that Bob De Niro. He introduced Dr. Strangelove, and which is now available on the AFI website, and it's widely available on streaming services. This is by far the best nuclear movie of all time. I mean, I really like this. It's dark humor, it's funny, and it accurately captures the mentality of the national security state to this day. to this day about how people think about this. And it even has, things like this doomsday machine, which was real. It turns out the Soviets really did have what David Hoffman described in his book, The Dead Hand, as an automated system where if the Soviet Union was attacked, and if the national command authorities were knocked out in a first strike, there would be an automatic retaliation, even though everybody was dead. An automatic retaliation from the Soviet Union. So there's a lot more truth in this. 1962 film than most people realize. That's my number one film. Did you like this, Michelle?
Oh yeah, Dr. Strangelove, definitely my number one.
Yeah. So here's my number two. And there's a lot to choose from, right? There's a lot. I mean, Failsafe, the original plus the George Clooney remake was very, very good on this. War Games, the Matthew Broderick film, just terrific. But I'm going way back. I'm going back to Them. This is a black and white 1950s sci-fi about giant ants that come out of the Nevada desert, triggered by nuclear testing. The radioactivity transforms these ants. And it was one of the early sort of anti-nuclear films. The ants obviously are a metaphor for the horrors we were unleashing with the nuclear age. It also features the first ever film appearance of Leonard Nimoy. He's on screen for about 10 seconds. He's just like a corporal in the army passing a telex to the commander. It's a fun film. It's worth watching, and it's just nice to go back to that simpler era, but a message that still resonates. And finally, I'm going to give you my third. Oh, wait, first, Michelle, did you ever see Them?
No, I haven't. Adding it to my list.
Yeah, maybe we're going to have a virtual film night. If the Plowshares offices were still open, we'd bring everybody together for beer and popcorn and watch this. But Them, go search for it, see if you can find it. It's great. And, there's others like this, Godzilla, of course, the monster triggered by the nuclear explosions. But Them is a classic. My third film is one that I was in, and it's Countdown to Zero. This was produced by Participant Media, the Jeff Skoll production company out in Los Angeles that has made most of the great documentaries and social content films that you've seen, from Lincoln all the way down. And he did a film that he hoped would be the equivalent of An Inconvenient Truth, the Al Gore film, which Participant Media also produced. And this one was about the dangers of nuclear weapons. And it has some great segments. For example, how could a terrorist build a nuclear bomb? Now, Jeffrey Lewis is featured on this, going through the steps and costing it out exactly what you would need to do this. How could they smuggle it in? Matthew Bunn from Harvard is in here describing how easy it is to smuggle a nuclear weapon in. I'm there talking about the close calls that we had, including the 1995 call where Russia at that time, Boris Yeltsin, came within seconds of launching an attack because they thought they were under attack. Their radar system had misidentified a Norwegian weather rocket as a U.S.-launched submarine-launched ballistic missile. It's still probably the best documentary on nuclear weapons and the risks we face that's out there. I recommend Countdown to Zero, again, widely available on streaming such as Netflix. So those are my top three.
Those are great. If I can add the other two that I would say, because Dr. Strangelove, definitely my number one. But the other two for me would be Hiroshima Mon Amour, 1959 film that's basically a deep conversation between a Japanese architect and a French actress. And it's a French new wave and just a very different way at looking at the impact of nuclear weapons, and is really just considered a very beautiful film. And then the other one is actually, Joe, have you ever seen this one? Copenhagen?
Oh, yeah. That is a great film, right? This conversation between Heisenberg and
Bohr.
And Bohr.
And Daniel Craig is in it. He's such a baby. Anyways, so those are the two that I would add.
Well, Michelle, you were always more sophisticated than I was. There's no question about it. You're a class act. Those are two great choices.
I need to watch them, clearly.
Well, and this is really unscripted. I did not know this was coming. I do not have any notes in front of me, though. That is my nuclear film list, and thanks for adding to it, Michelle. And thank you for the question. Wherever you are in New Mexico, thanks for listening and thanks for asking.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.